Thursday, January 13th, 2022 at 1 o'clock. And I call to order the informational briefing of the House Water and Land Committee. We will be talking with the Department of Land and Natural Resources today concerning forestry and wildlife, as well as endangered species. So to begin, Deputy Director Masuda, if you could please go ahead and introduce your team before the presentations begin.
Thank you very much, Vice Chair Branco and Chair Tarnas. We're delighted to be with the House Water Land Committee. You folks have been so supportive. The last session we've had a chance to do some outstanding work thanks to your support. So we think it's important that we share as much as we can on all of the terrestrial and marine flora and fauna that you are working so hard to protect. So to moderate and coordinate our presentation today is Emma Ewan, who is a Program Administrator for our Native Species and Ecosystems branch. And so Emma, I'm going to turn it over to you now that I've had a chance to thank our supporters in our work together.
Great, thank you. And we'll begin by I'm going to share some of our accomplishments as well as some of the threats that we face. And we'll start by going through a bunch of the different species, seabirds, plants, forest birds, invertebrates, and then we'll talk about overall the ecosystem level work that needs to happen to really recover these species. So that's how we're going to be organized today. And so we'll start off with Afshin Siddiqui. She is our wildlife biologist who is in charge of seabirds and water birds. Afshin?
Thanks, Emma. Thank you, committee, for giving us an opportunity to discuss some of the work that we are doing. My name is Afshin Siddiqui, and as Emma said, I work on seabirds and water birds with DOFA. And as you may know, a lot of our plants and animals in the Hawaiian Islands are vulnerable to a lot of impacts that they didn't evolve with, that humans brought. And so that includes things like mammalian land predators, and they lack defenses to fight against things like dogs, cats, rats, mongooses. And then in addition, seabirds are also impacted by human infrastructure, such as lights and power lines. So if we can go to the next slide. Thanks. So the three listed seabirds that we have in Hawaii are the a'o and ua'u, which are found nowhere else in the world. So Hawaii is the only home for these breeding seabirds. In addition, we have the akeake, or the banded storm petrel, where we know little information about, but they do breed throughout the Pacific. All three of these species are montane seabirds. They come to Hawaii to breed every year, and data that we've gathered from Kauai has shown that species like the a'o and ua'u are really dramatically declining in the Hawaiian Islands. The a'o specifically, which is 90% of the population is found on the island of Kauai, has shown a dramatic decline of about 94%. And ua'u has shown also a dramatic decline of 78%. And as I said, main threats to these birds include non-native species that are predating on the birds, as well as negative interactions that they have with man-made structures such as lights and power lines. Next slide. So DOFA, the main thing that we do for seabird recovery, we rely on finding where these birds are breeding and protecting those birds where they are existing. And that consists mainly of doing predator control and habitat management. Other management techniques that we use include creating seabird refugia through predator control or fencing, and then bringing those birds to those safe areas through either social attraction or translocating birds to those safe places. Additionally, in impacts such as power line strikes and lights need to be reduced and mitigated so that we can ensure that these endangered seabirds continue to persist in Hawaii. Funding for colony monitoring and management is significantly supported by federal funding programs that we have, as well as competitive grant funding programs. Next slide. So similarly for water birds, again, they evolve without having the pressures of things like dogs, cats, and rats on the landscape. So a lot of what the state does to recover these birds is to manage the areas where they're breeding and foraging. And a lot of that is basically managing our wetland areas. You go to the next slide, please. So in Hawaii, we have 5 listed water bird and waterfowl species that are found nowhere else in the world. Here pictured are those 5 species. So we have the nene or Hawaiian goose, the io or Hawaiian stilt, the alai ke'o, Hawaiian coot, the alai ula or the Hawaiian gallinule, the koloa maoli or the Hawaiian duck, and the laysan duck, which is found only in the Papahanaumokuakea National Marine Monument. And that is one of the most critically endangered ducks in the world. Again, these species are vulnerable to threats of non-native predators, habitat loss and degradation, and also disease. So our key priority for these species is protecting them from predation and try to increase their suitable habitat so they can persist. So we conduct biennial water bird surveys throughout the islands. And here's a map of these surveys consist of mainly focusing on the 4 water bird species that inhabit our wetlands or rely on our wetlands. And so from the survey data, we can get information on distribution and trends. And here you can see the map of where these birds are distributed. On the island of Kauai, all 4 of these listed water bird species currently persist on the island, are really our stronghold, likely because there's more available habitat for these species and the lack of mongoose that has not invaded Kauai. Oahu has 3 of the 4 listed water bird species, and then Maui Nui and Hawaii Islands support the io and alai ke'o. Also, I don't have pictured here, but nene also inhabit mainly Kauai, again, is the stronghold for that species. And then Maui and Hawaii Islands also support nene populations as well. So our partners at USGS have done state space modeling and looking at the long-term trends. So they looked at data from 1986 to 2016, and then also short-term trends. So 2006 to 2016, to look at, what is the abundance of the populations in Hawaii. The most numerous species that we do have is the io, which has just under 2,000 birds that exist throughout the islands. The alai ke'o has about 1,815 individuals in the 5-year average. And then we have also the alai ula, which is only found on Kauai and Oahu with an estimated abundance of 927 birds. The koloa maoli, this species, the only purebred population that we have for this species is on Kauai. The rest of the populations are a hybrid population with mallards that have inhabited the Hawaiian Islands. So on Kauai, the average abundance is estimated to be about 931 birds. All 4 species had positive trends over the long term, but in the short term, there's island-specific trends were a little bit more variable. In some cases, they were negative, as you can see in the table there. So waterbird recovery relies on managing populations in the wetlands. And again, as I said, this includes predator control, invasive species, vegetation management. This is our main focus. We use a lot of competitive federal grant funding to do large restoration projects in our wetlands, but these areas are often underfunded in terms of maintaining the the invasive plants and animals at bay once these areas are restored. So these are long-term type of management actions that are required at wetlands. Wetlands are really important habitats, especially in the face of climate change impacts, floodwater retention during storm runoff events and things like that. So again, funding for wetland management and waterbird recovery is significantly supported by federal funding sources, either through competitive or non-competitive funding. And then again, I just wanted to mention, we did receive Maui Cip Funds, and we are planning a predator-proof fence around the Kanaha Pond Wildlife Sanctuary. So our budget request for this year includes CIP funds to support our work on Lehua Island. As you may know, Lehua is our wildlife sanctuary off of Kauai. Last year, in April, we declared it rat-free through extensive work with our partners. And our next phase includes plant restoration and bringing back some of those endangered species that once inhabited the island but are no longer there, and ensuring the biosecurity measures are in place so we don't have a re-infestation of rats to the island. So our request includes $60,000 to improve the facilities that are on the island, including the weather dome that's pictured here, as well as the deck and the lua, and then a water system. In addition, we want to install a permanent mooring so other divisions within the department can do surveys underwater, and we can get a good assessment of the coral and marine life around the island as well. And then the other CIP request we have with regards to seabirds is to build a predator-proof fence around a new found colony of uau on Mauna Kea. So this uau burrow was discovered in May of 2021. It's the first time an uau bird was discovered, a burrow was discovered on Mauna Kea in over half a century. This was done in partnership with UH Hilo and the Center for Mauna Kea Stewardship. So we really want to protect, this new colony that we found. In addition, there are the Mauna Kea silver sport exists on this, and this is also found nowhere else in the world. So preserving the populations of silver swords is also important and part of this project that we have. And I think that's all the slides I have. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And we're going to go over to Matt here to talk about our plants now.
Thank you. I'm going to share the screen here. See all the plants. All right, hopefully you're seeing that now. Good afternoon. My name is Matt Kier, and I work as a botanist at the department with a focus on endangered plant conservation. Hawaii has a rich native flora with almost 1,400 species of native plants. They are the dense rainforests that blanket upper slopes of our islands, and there are naupaka along our coasts, protecting shorelines from the wind and waves. And they are unique species found nowhere else on Earth that are at home in upper elevation bogs and alpine areas. New land is brought to life when kupu-kupu and ohia begin to take root in the rock. And Hawaii's native plants are the foundation of culture and perpetuate indigenous knowledge and practices. And they are extremely beautiful. The rain falls on plants and slowly drips through moss and ferns to recharge our streams and aquifers. And when native plants are not there, the rain takes the land with it. Ecological relationships between plants and animals keep our forests alive, and all life, including ours, is dependent on plants for food, shelter, air, and water. And they are home for thousands of other creatures, like this Oahu elepaia. There are lots of plants in Hawaii, but most of the ones in our lei, on our postcards, and in our yards are not native. These are weeds, and they're poor replacements for our native plants. Nearly all of our native plants are endemic, found nowhere else on Earth. They are adapted to Hawaii and evolved into a world with no mosquitoes, no rats, no pigs, and for a long time, no people. When that changed, new plants and animals arrived, and we started losing species. Over 100 native plants are now completely extinct. These were eaten, trampled, and smothered by alien invasive species. Almost half of our native plants are in urgent need of conservation, requiring direct intervention to prevent their extinction. Nearly 10% are already extinct. 1/3 of our plants are listed as threatened or endangered species, like our state flower, Ma'ohauhele, and another 10th, like koa and ohia, are critically important for wildlife habitat. In places where threats are not controlled, the number of endangered plants is still increasing. And it's worth noting that plant extinction crisis in Hawaii is much more urgent and troubling than in any other state. Hawaii has more than twice the number of endangered plants than California does, and most other states are not even on the page. This is an outsized burden for our state that has 1/10 of 1% of the land in the entire country. But our unique flora is also a blessing. Some of Hawaii's rare plants are famous, like Haleakala silver swords and olulu from the cliffs of Molokai. People come here to see them, and they represent what makes Hawaii unique. You can go anywhere in the world to see ginger, but you must come to Hawaii to see silver swords. The Division of Forestry and Wildlife has 4 districts to manage natural resources. This chart shows there are plenty of endangered plants and work to do in each district. The rarest of our rare plants are targets for our plant extinction prevention program and need to be rescued. There are more than 100 plant species on the brink of extinction, having fewer than 10 individual plants remaining in the wild. The primary cause for the decline in native plants are ubiquitous and well known. First, fencing is installed to slow down the damage caused by feral pigs, deer, goats, and sheep. Then weeds, like strawberry guava, need to be cleared from beneath fruiting plants to allow keiki to survive. Rats can eat entire plants and all the seeds before they hit the ground, so they need to be controlled, especially during the fruiting season. And slug bait needs to be deployed year-round to protect seedlings. Often, these actions are too late or just not enough to prevent more extinctions. So to respond to the crisis, small, specialized teams of botanists are working on each island to secure collections and grow more plants to increase populations. We have a dedicated team working in difficult conditions to save species, and we really love our jobs. I hope you had a chance to watch the recent TV special, The Cliff Dwellers of Kauai, that featured our staff. To be successful, our team does surveys to find the last plants, like this loulu palm from Oahu, controls the animals that are eating them, secures collections of seeds, grows them at special rare plant nurseries, then plants them back into the wild. The most efficient way to hold plants in collections until they can be used is seed storage. Using state and federal funds, our department contracts the Lion Arboretum in Manoa for this work, and it is the primary state repository. Lastly, last year, the legislature approved a CIP project to invest in much-needed upgrades to the seed bank facility at Lion, and other startup operations have been initiated at our base yards and at botanical gardens. One promising new technology is cryogenic storage. Research at Lion Arboretum, again funded by state and federal dollars, is showing that seeds and other plant parts can be kept alive over liquid nitrogen for years or even decades. Having safe places to hold rare species will give us time to prepare habitats for their eventual return. This important conservation work is supported by state, federal, and private funding. Every dollar in state funds made available to DOFA is used to leverage federal grants from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service at a rate of at least $3 federal for every state dollar. Investing in plant conservation today will return the forests we need to meet the challenges of a changing climate. Some plants, like Kanaloa o Palu Palu, are not yet ready to go back into the wild, so they are being held in large pots at nurseries on Maui. Kanaloa o Palu Palu is one of the world's rarest species. 2 plants were discovered in the wild on a sea stack off the coast of Kaho'olawe in 1992. Just 2 live seeds were collected and successfully grown from the plants, and until last year, these 2 nursery plants were the only Kanaloa alive in the world. Last year, the plants were hand-pollinated and produced 20 new seedlings for the first time. And just like with rare animals in zoos, these last remaining plants hold all the hope for the future of this species. And as plant extinctions increase in the wild, these nurseries will become more and more important in preventing total extinction. Another amazing story from our team is that a new species of native plant was recently discovered on Hawaii Island. This unfamiliar plant was found by department staff in 2019, but when botanists returned to the site, it was gone. Soil samples were collected from beneath where it grew and brought to the nursery facility in Volcano, where a few months later, 2 seedlings emerged from the pot. These plants are being hand-pollinated and cloned, so the species is not lost again, and a new name will be announced this year. These important nursery facilities are operating on Kauai, Oahu, Maui, and Hawaii Island, where greenhouses are placed at mid-elevation sites where there are fewer pest problems and cooler weather. Altogether, these facilities produce 10 to 15,000 endangered plants for planting every year, but they are relying on old infrastructure and technology to keep plants protected and watered. There are 2 CIP requests to improve and expand nursery facilities. D109, Rare Plant Facilities Modernization and Disaster Preparation, will provide funds to protect rare plant facilities on 4 islands from dangerous storms and upgrade aging infrastructure to provide more plants. D219 targets nurseries on Maui and Hawaii Island for expansion and new equipment to increase production of native trees for reforestation of public lands and for community groups. These investments will reduce maintenance costs and enable our state to meet its goals for reforesting our watersheds. In summary, the rate of plant extinctions is increasing every year. However, if we can get to them on time and secure collections, total extinction is preventable. We will need these to meet the challenges of increased wildfire and storms driven by climate change and chronic invasions of new pests that get past our biosecurity gates. Recent invasions by the coconut rhinoceros beetle, myrtle rust, Nio thrips, and the rammy moth, and ongoing impacts of rapid ohia death directly impact our native plants. Our forests are already responding to a changing climate. And so new technologies like drones, seed banks, and cryogenics will help us meet these challenges. Smart investments like the legislature has made in the past few years in seed banking and micropropagation at Lion Arboretum should continue and expand to other islands and their nurseries with CIPs D109 and 219. These will ensure we can secure our native plants and prevent total extinction and meet the challenge to Malama Ainu. Mahalo for your time and continuing support for our native plants. Aloha.
Thank you so much, Matt. I'm going to jump in and give an overview briefly about our endangered species or our endangered forest birds, which unfortunately also are really dealing with a very urgent extinction crisis. We have over 70 species of endangered of forest birds originally in Hawaii, but around 20 are left. So we've lost a majority of our species already. And just in the last couple of decades, we've gotten 8 species listed as extinct. And one of them, for instance, the Kauai o'o, which has this incredibly haunting, beautiful call, was actually the last member of its entire avian family, the Mahoidae, which represents the only time in modern times has an entire family of avian birds gone extinct globally. So it was just a huge loss when we lost the o'o, as well as all these other species. One really unique type of bird in Hawaii is the honey creepers, which were originally thought to have come from a single colonizer and then evolved over millennia into all these over 50 species. Unfortunately, now only 17 remain, and these type of species, these honey creepers, are incredibly threatened and rare. And so this is a slide showing those remaining species, and the top 6 that you see are so rare that there are fewer than 2,000 individuals remaining in the wild. And the 2 on the left, the kiwikiu on Maui and the akikiki on Kauai, have around 100 individuals remaining in the wild. So just populations are crashing. We're really needing to get these translocated and reproduce in our breeding facilities. We have another few 6 honey creepers shown on the bottom that also are declining. Some of these are also listed as endangered. The threats are similar to our water birds. Habitat loss, these are really reliant on these upland watershed forests, but they also have an additional problem, which is the diseases spread by mosquitoes, which are fatal. And we're going to learn more about that in the next presentation, but makes these upland forests the last refugia for these species, which are incredibly important for our native Hawaiian culture. And these forests, I mean, they are the pollinators, they are the seed spreaders for our forests, and also have so many cultural meanings, from the feather cloaks of the li'i and so many just connections to these beautiful birds that really just make Hawaii iconically Hawaii. So a lot of the work that we're doing, we're going to go over next with the Mosquito Control Project. And we're also really trying to find ways to be more efficient with predator control, like rat control, cat control. We have to translocate and breed these birds and really strengthen our captive breeding capacity. And then, as I mentioned, protect the habitat, these upper watershed forests. One of the CIP requests for forest birds this year is $200,000 for the Mauna Kea Fence. And this is a recurring CIP that you folks have supported in the past, but this would allow us to complete that fence, which is encircling the entire Mauna Kea, about 90,000 acres that it encloses. And it's a 52-mile long fence that we're building. And it's a court-ordered fence to protect the Mamane Naio habitat, which is critical for the survival of our palila bird. Now I'm going to go over to Cynthia King, who's our state entomologist, and she's going to talk more about the Mosquito Project. And that work is really tied in with keeping our upland native forest birds alive. So go ahead, Cynthia.
Thanks, Emma. Good afternoon, Chair, Vice Chair, and committee members. As Emma mentioned, I'm Cynthia King, and I'm an entomologist, and I'm going to talk to you today about the approach Dlnr is interested in taking to try and control mosquitoes, which vector avian malaria to our forest birds. Just to provide some background, no mosquitoes are native to Hawaii, and the mosquito we're focusing on today is the southern house mosquito, which was originally introduced by a whaling vessel to Maui in 1826. Avian malaria, like human malaria, is a disease that's caused by a parasite that's spread by mosquitoes. And the disease itself was introduced to Hawaii via non-native birds early in the 20th century. But because they evolved in the absence of malaria and in the absence of the mosquitoes that transmit it, native Hawaiian birds, particularly our honey creepers, lost their natural immunities that their mainland ancestors had and are really highly susceptible to avian malaria. So much so that a single bite can kill a honey creeper. Our native forest birds have mostly been wiped out from lower elevation areas where the mosquitoes are found, but they've been able to persist in higher elevations and higher elevation habitat that's too cold for the mosquitoes and for the avian malaria. Next slide. However, climate change, there we go. However, climate change is increasing temperatures at these higher elevations and changing rainfall patterns too, which allows mosquitoes and avian malaria to persist in those environments. The areas that were formerly mosquito-free and safe are now being invaded, and as Emma mentions, that's threatening to wipe out the honey creepers in these last safe holds. Next slide, please. Some of you might be very familiar with the approach DLNR is pursuing, but for those of you who are not, I'll explain what incompatible insect technique is. I see that the animations aren't on the slides. So in short, incompatible insect technique, I should say, is the most promising tool we have to control mosquitoes and stop the extinctions of our forest birds. And the reason that is because, like most organisms, insects carry different bacteria inside of them that can influence their biology. In humans, bacteria are really essential for our bodies to function. They can influence everything from how we fight infections on an individual basis to what kind of allergies we express and how we digest our food. So just like some people might eat Activia yogurt to get helpful bacteria to aid in digesting their food, we can actually use bacteria as a tool to reduce mosquito populations. And that's because in insects, including in mosquitoes, there are bacteria that affect their reproduction. So a mosquito can have a certain type of bacteria so a mosquito can have a certain type of bacteria that makes reproduction with another mosquito impossible. And that's what this bottom figure is indicating. If mosquitoes have the same bacteria, then they can reproduce and lay eggs, and those eggs will hatch. So basically, the approach of using mosquito with a different kind of bacteria to control other mosquitoes can be referred to as birth control, because the mosquitoes will actually still mate and lay eggs, but the eggs won't hatch. And that's what we want to see in order to affect populations. Next slide, please. So the bacteria that makes incompatible insect technique work is called Wolbachia. And Wolbachia is an endosymbiotic bacteria, which is just a fancy way of saying that it lives inside the body or cells of another organism. So in this case, it lives inside of insect cells, and it can't live within human cells, and it can't live on its own outside of insect cells. Wolbachia was originally identified from mosquitoes, but it's since been identified in approximately 60% of terrestrial insects worldwide. And it's present in all sorts of species in Hawaii already, including the fruit flies in your kitchen and the aphids and honeybees that are out in your garden. This image on the slide is an image of an insect cell, and those large circles within it are Wolbachia. The biology behind the reproductive incompatibility is pretty complicated, but the outcome is really simple. It makes it such that when boy mosquito meets girl mosquito, they can't make baby mosquitoes. Next slide, please. So how does it work in practice, though? Again, the slide doesn't have the animations. So you can imagine initially that you're just seeing a female mosquito, the one circled in yellow on the slide, on its own. And in order to have that female reproduce successfully in the wild, she has to find a mate. For example, that other wild type male also in the yellow there, and mate with that mosquito with the same bacteria and lay eggs. But if you flood a system with male mosquitoes that are incompatible because they've been given Wolbachia, the likelihood is that only a small portion of the females, the wild females, will be able to find and reproduce with wild males. Most females are going to encounter and mate with an incompatible male because those are the odds. And if you flood a system over multiple generations with incompatible males, you're going to see a significant crash in mosquito populations. And what's notable about this is we're only releasing male mosquitoes. And some folks don't know this, but male mosquitoes don't bite people or animals because they only feed on flower nectar. It's only the females that bite for blood meals. It's also notable that this method requires continual applications of males with incompatible Wolbachia to achieve the population suppression. So if the release is stopped, the system actually just returns to normal and the mosquito populations will rebound. But this is just emphasizing that this isn't something that's self-propelling in the environment. Next slide, please. This approach and compatible insect technique using Wolbachia was developed with public health in mind to control mosquitoes that cause human diseases. So this is a map of all the locations around the US and around the world where field trials or releases have been conducted using Wolbachia mosquitoes already. But if a project were to move forward in Hawaii to control the southern house mosquito, it would be the first project to use incompatible insect technique for conservation. Next slide, please. To be clear, there's no immediate timeframe for release of incompatible mosquitoes in Hawaii. However, we're certainly considering what field applications would look like, given that most of the areas we want to benefit from this approach are really remote and difficult to access and work in. We don't know what the optimal frequency is of releases for the male mosquitoes at some of these sites, but based on other projects, they could range from releases once a week to once per month at a given site. And we would be targeting months of the year, particularly when mosquito populations are often building up and peaking on the landscape. Monitoring would also be a critical part of the process prior to any releases and of course following, and that would allow us to fine tune releases in terms of timing and frequency and spacing and the number of mosquitoes needed, number of incompatible males needed to achieve control. Next slide, please. If the project moves forward, we anticipate that mosquitoes would initially be produced and shipped into Hawaii by collaborators at facilities on the mainland, but the goal will eventually be to transition production to Hawaii. A first small step in that process would be to house mosquitoes at our Dlnr insectary space. So as Emma mentioned, there is a $100,000 CIP ask to request that the costs, or to assist with the costs of renovating the insectary and installing secondary containment that would allow us to house mosquitoes. So that is something that we're asking the legislature for this year. Next slide, please. So what are the next steps we're looking at right now? Dlnr is currently collaborating with National Park Service on an environmental assessment for East Maui, and we completed initial public scoping meetings in December and January, just last week. And we anticipate that an EA will be completed in late 2022. We're also initiating work on an EA for Kauai, which will be hopefully conducted concurrently. And Dlnr and DOH are going to be collaborating on a statewide EA, which will cover assessing the potential use of incompatible insect technique for the southern house mosquito, as well as 2 Aedes mosquitoes of public health concern. Dlnr and DOH are also have also submitted a joint import permit to the Hawaii Department of Agriculture in July, and we're awaiting review by the Board of Agriculture and its subcommittees. Any import of incompatible males for actual management work would be contingent on this permit request. And of course, we hope to prepare the insectary. Next slide, please. There are a lot of steps though that need to be taken before a project like this can move forward. And so we are working with a big group of folks, broadly known as the Birds Not Mosquitoes project, or Birds Not Mosquitoes Working Group, comprised of other state, federal, and private organizations. So far, I think collectively, our most optimistic estimate for implementation is that we may have limited field trials that could occur in 2023, with actual releases on the landscape possible in 2024. And with that, I'm going to shift topics a little bit to share about the Dlnr Hawaii Invertebrate Program, which is focused on our native species. Next slide, please. So most people associate endangered species in Hawaii with some of the species that you've already seen with birds and also large lovable sea creatures like the sea turtles and seals. However, the bulk of our biodiversity is actually worldwide, as well as in Hawaii, is actually invertebrates. We have nearly 6,500 described species of native invertebrates, and they account for approximately 87% of all of the biodiversity here in Hawaii. It's notable that invertebrates, even the unlisted ones, are considered wildlife and protected equally under our state laws. Some of the responsibilities that the Hawaii Invertebrate Program has include conducting surveys, initiating research and management. We issue permits, review invertebrate components of environmental compliance documents that we have, and as I mentioned earlier, even participate in detection and monitoring and control of invasive invertebrate species that have landscape scale impacts on our native ecosystems. Next slide, please. In order to fund the projects we conduct,
Cynthia, I'm going to have to escape really quickly and start this over because I'm not sure why it's advancing on its own. Okay, go ahead. Hopefully that fixed it.
Okay. So we, similar to what Matt described, we leverage state general funds to apply for competitive and non-competitive federal grants, and we've been very persistent about trying to diversify our funding sources and apply for many opportunities as we can. And happy to report that our program has grown successfully and is gradually increasing in capacity. These funds create jobs by supporting full-time staff and projects across the state. And we generally have been really successful about leveraging our general funds at a ratio of about 5-to-1 with our federal funds. This slide just provides an overview of our various project personnel. Most of the projects and personnel are directly managed by us at Dlnr, but sometimes we do slight funds over to researchers at University of Hawaii at Manoa. Just 2 of our positions, myself and my colleague who you'll hear next, have civil service positions. Next slide, please. The first component of HIP I just want to highlight quickly is our native invertebrate captive rearing program. So back in 2014, we leveraged state funds and received Section 6 funds from Fish and Wildlife Service to establish an insectary. And despite the fact that there were captive rearing programs for rare birds and we had rare plant nurseries on every island, the only insect mass rearing for Hawaii previous to this was for biocontrol programs or for sterile male technique for pest fruit flies for agriculture. So getting funds to create a dedicated space for captive rearing of native insect species is really amazing. Unfortunately, where the labs are currently located in Kauai Nui and Kailua is a floodplain. So every time we've had a hurricane approach or a significant flood advisory, our staff have had to evacuate the species from the labs to safer buildings, which is pretty disruptive. So we're very grateful to have received FY 2021 CIP funds to relocate the insectary and snail labs from Kauai Nui to a safer location at our Waimano base yard. And the groundwork that needs to happen before we can actually move them is actually going to get underway next month, starting February 7th. Next slide, please. So one project that relies on the insectary space is our orange-black damselfly project. At one time, this damselfly was one of the most common species of endemic damselflies in the state, but as the story goes, due to the impacts of introduced predators, specifically in this case, introduced piscillid fishes, mosquito fishes, the species of damselfly has experienced really sharp declines and disappeared from a lot of islands. So it's now federally listed as endangered. And as a fun fact, for decades, there was just a single population left on Oahu that persisted in a 100-meter stretch of stream up at Dlnr. The DoD was aware of the species after it was detected, so the habitat was supplemented by a hose that's always left on at a trickle to ensure that the culvert that the species was found in doesn't dry out. So our goal over the last 4 years has been to establish a second population and reduce the likelihood that this species will be extirpated from Oahu entirely if some sort of stochastic event happens, either a natural disaster like a hurricane or flood, or also some sort of chemical spill at Dlnr. Next slide, please. But finding a naturally occurring field site that doesn't already have predatory fish has been a big challenge. There are other criteria that we would ideally love to have in our release sites in terms of the environment and the prey abundance, but being fish-free and being located a safe distance from other water sources that are also that do have fish and that could serve as an ecological sink is really key. Next slide, please. Yep. We learned a ton over the course of the project, from trying to figure out how to make damselflies to how to appropriately diversify their diet and how to increase pigmentation of the naiads so they can camouflage better. And we've just learned a lot, but long story short, next slide, please. We finally have a second reproducing population of damselflies on Oahu. The new site is a spring-fed seep up at Dlnr, behind the airfield up there. And the stream stretches for about 200 meters, but doesn't have any surface flow connection to lower reaches of the stream, which is really important because that's the corridor up through where invasive fish could invade. So the fact that it doesn't have surface connection to lower reaches is really great. And we, to date, have released almost 5,000 damselflies at the site, and wild-born individuals have continued to be sighted, and they're mating and defending territories and doing what they should be doing. It's been for over a year and a half now, including after those big rains we had in December, so it's looking good. We work in partnership with the Oahu Army Natural Resources Program for many of our endangered species, and this is the case with the Damselfly project as well. So their staff assist in site preparation in this case, and just recently installed a small fence at the bottom of the stretch of water to protect the emergent vegetation from pigs. And so in general, as with a lot of our projects, this is a really small and really efficient investment to prevent the extinction of a species on Oahu. And we actually were just awarded another 3-year grant from Fish and Wildlife Service to continue work with the species. And our goal is going to be to reestablish populations on Maui Nui as well, and then hopefully expand to one other endangered species. And with that, I'll pass this along to my colleague, Dr. David Sisko. Thank you for your time.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dave Sisko, and I'm a wildlife biologist with the Division of Forestry and Wildlife. And we're going to switch gears and speak to another program nestled within the Hawaii Invertebrate program aimed at conserving Hawaii's rare and endangered snails. You might know them as kohuli. Kohuli are famed and revered in Hawaii as they are said to have a voice and sing, and consequently have close ties to Hawaiian culture and are associated with hula and chant. Hawaii had one of the most remarkable land snail species radiations in the world, with over 750 species found nowhere else on Earth. And as you can see, there's great diversity of form and color, and they are really beautiful animals. Hawaii's snail diversity is comparable to that existing in all of North America, and Hawaii is 1/1700th the land area of North America. So just an incredible amount of biodiversity packed into these small islands that exist nowhere else on Earth. Next slide. Unfortunately, as is the case in a lot of instances, introduced predators are driving the mass extinction of Hawaii's terrestrial snail fauna, most notably rats, which are a problem for a lot of species, Jackson's chameleons, which were introduced here through the pet trade in the 1970s, but the most insidious of the introduced threats are from the rosy wolf snail in the top left corner. This is a introduced biocontrol that was introduced in the 1950s to control giant African snails, which probably all of you are familiar with. Unfortunately, it's not a good biocontrol, and it's now on all main Hawaiian islands and up in some of our most remote, pristine forest reserves, and they're just vacuuming up our native snails. Next slide. Climate change is also threatening to reduce the range of land snails and shift ranges due to changing weather patterns and drying trends across the islands, particularly in leeward areas. This figure shows the Waianae Mountains of the western portion of Oahu from Kaena Point in the top down to Makakilo at the bottom. And you can see this is the current range of Acatinella mustelina, a beautiful species that only exists in the Waianae Mountains. And its projected range in 2080 shrinks up to just the very top of Mount Kaala, which is that green mass you see on the right-hand figure. Next slide. So I told you earlier that we had 750 species of unique snails in the islands, and unfortunately introduced predators have already eliminated about half of those. They're gone, they're extinct. And we're going to lose another 100 species in the next decade without significant conservation intervention. The scale and the rapidity of this loss is staggering, to say the least. Next slide. Our immediate strategy is using captive rearing and predator-proof fencing to secure and stabilize populations. The long game includes increasing population redundancy across the landscape, and in captivity, and working towards control and eradication of predators from larger landscape scale areas. Next slide. We at Dlnr have a captive rearing facility that maintains 40 species from 5 islands. Most of what we maintain in the facility no longer have wild counterparts. They are gone in the wild, and they only exist in our facility. Next slide. Predator-proof fencing has become an essential tool in the fight against kahuli extinction. Dlnr and partners across the state currently have 11 of these small units across islands, but we need about 50 of them to conserve what we're losing. These fences are currently our only tool for reintroducing and keeping snails on the landscape where they belong. You can see these are different from a typical fence. They have a solid wall barrier. They have a hood at the top, a curved hood that keeps rodents out and Jackson's chameleons out. And then at the bottom, there's a little gauntlet that rosy wolf snails have to go through if they try and cross, and that includes a angled skirt that's at 15 degrees. That's difficult for rosy wolf snails to cross. Cut copper wire mesh that's really pokey and difficult for them to cross. But if they cross that, we electrocute them. So the combination of those three barriers is really effective at keeping the inside habitat safe. Next slide. We have several CIP requests that I'll point out for much needed fence units on 3 islands, D215 for Molokai, D102 for West Maui, and D107 for Oahu. And the benefits of these fences are that they would be the only fences that exist in these areas that prevent the imminent extinction of snail species that are unique to these islands that exist nowhere else. So these are important fence units that we're requesting. Next slide. This is just another example to give you an idea of the scale. They're small fences. They're not landscape scale. They don't impact hunting or anything like that. They're relatively small, but the impacts are immense. We can keep multiple species in here, and the snails thrive, and their populations often grow into the thousands. Next slide. As an example of the urgency of this work, I'm going to tell you a little bit about a species that our team has worked really hard to save over the years. This is Acatenella fulgens, a beautiful tree snail once common in the mountains surrounding Honolulu and used extensively in lei. If you've ever seen a kahuli lei, many of them have Acatenella fulgens shells in them. In 2016, during an extreme rain event, there was a landslide that took out the last known population of Acatenella fulgens. Our team was only able to recover 6 of them. And in this picture, you're looking at a picture of the last 4 adult Acatenella fulgens in the world as of 2016. Next slide. Through captive rearing, our dedicated staff have brought this and many other species back from the very brink of extinction. In 2016, Acatenella fulgens was literally days away from going extinct. And now next year, they will be reintroduced back into the wild into a predator-proof fence in the Honolulu Watershed Forest Reserve, back where in their native range where they belong. This fence was constructed with funding from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Next slide. In closing, while we have made significant progress on a lot of fronts, thanks to investment from the state of Hawaii and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Hawaii is facing a crossroads. Over the next decade, hundreds of our native species will be facing extinction. We have the tools and the ability to prevent this from happening, but we really have to scale things up. As I mentioned, we have 11 fences, but we need 50. If we're going to prevent this mass loss of biodiversity over the next decade, we have to scale things up, and we have a lot to lose. And I thank you for your time, and that's all I have to share today.
Thank you so much, David. And I'm going to close out this briefing and give a little overview of the Watershed Initiative, because one thing that's really important is we can't have any of these species without protecting their habitat. And so that's the key for long-term recovery of these species. We have a goal, the Sustainable Hawaii Watershed Initiative goal, to protect 30% of our watershed forests by 2030. And we were at 10% at 2011, and now we're up to 17%. And a lot of the CIP funding that you folks have authorized has allowed us to get further and further along to that goal. We have a plan for where we need to protect those areas to reach that 2030 goal. The areas already protected are in purple, and what we need to do to reach 2030 is in red here. This year, we have, for fiscal year 13, $4 million appropriated, and we're asking as a supplemental budget request for an additional $4 million for fences statewide that would help us keep on building these protected areas. And so that's one of our CIP in the executive budget. This past year, we've built 13 miles of fence, and we currently have 39 different fence projects statewide. So all across the state, high up in the mountains, there's these fence crews, hardworking, building these protective areas for our forests. So we really thank those men and women out there. And you know, in addition to providing jobs for these folks, it's really this watershed funding then really exponentially increases the amount of federal grants that we're able to get. We've calculated that since 2013, the Watershed Initiative funding from the state has allowed us to get $49 million of non-state grant funds. And this would not be possible if we didn't have that state investment. Some of the amazing ones we got just in the past year, we got $5.2 million from NRCS for invasive weed control. $1.2 million recently announced from the Army and NIFWIF for projects in Puvawa and Oahu, fire break, weed control. Molokai, we got $1.8 million for additional fencing and ecosystem protection. And just recently we got announced from NIFWIF $1.6 million to support invasive weed removal in the Alawai. And the interesting thing about the last two grants that I mentioned is that the first time that we've gotten funds that were going to help our forests, but they're specifically because of flood prevention. So they're targeting forests, protecting our forests for reducing the incidences of floods. And that's really been supported by a lot of research that has come out in the last year that shows when we lose our forests and our uplands, which are the rainiest and steepest parts of our landscape, are looking like this, bare soil, they really do not have that infiltration capacity. And what I mean by that is when the rains hit, it's just, bare soil, it just bounces off and doesn't nicely absorb into the ground the way it does with forests. So when you change the land cover across these tens of thousands of acres, you dramatically increase the threat of floods in the lowlands. And even when you have a native forest, but it's unfenced and still being damaged by hoofed animals, that compaction really reduces the ability for those lands to absorb water, with a study that just came out this past year. And so maybe from afar it looks green, but when you go up close, a lot of these mountains are really suffering from the impacts of invasive hoofed animals and weeds. And it's also a major problem with erosion that comes down along with those floods. And I'm just going to say that we had enormous success in Molokai when we did remove hoofed animals, and just showing before we did hoofed animal removal, and this is shots from Molokai, just photo points. 2015 we had fenced an area, you can see little seedlings coming up, and then now in 2020 this amazing restoration, and none of these were planted. This is just all passive forest restoration, and that's really critical because the Greenhouse Gas Sequestration Task Force came out with a study that basically looked at 21 different ways that we can best absorb our greenhouse gases in our natural and agricultural lands, and found that protecting our forests was the #1 ranked action that we can do, with 198 million tons of avoided emissions. So in comparison, the second ranked one was 5 million tons. So this huge difference in this huge amount of importance for greenhouse gases as well. In addition, as you folks probably know, there's a lot of need for these forests to absorb water and recharge our aquifers as well. And so just to kind of summarize about these fences, we have hoofed animal fences, snail predator fences, and the bird fences that we are really reliant on as the long-term and effective and cost-effective way to secure these species. So I'm going to talk about hoofed animal fences first, and just make the point that, this has been shown in the last year to be extremely important for rapid ohia death prevention. For instance, UH researchers in University of Hawaii at Hilo have shown that up to 69 times more rapid ohia death mortality in areas with hoofed animals and right next door in areas that are fenced and protected. So this is a really key tool to reduce the threat of rapid ohia death. And so this is showing the remaining native vegetation in green here. And unfortunately, you see already half of our native vegetation is already lost. So that's a huge problem already. And then the remaining third that exists of our land cover is largely unprotected. In fact, only 5% of our land cover is fenced and still remaining native forest. So the remainder are really largely unprotected from this top priority threat of hoofed animals. Going over to our bird and snail fences, you can just see across the landscape where they've been constructed, most in the last couple of years. In fact, almost none of these were even there a decade ago. So we've done a lot of work, but these are all very tiny and are the only real places in our main Hawaiian Islands that are safe from predators. So just to summarize, I hope you folks come out of this remembering that a third of all listed species in the United States that are threatened and endangered are known only from Hawaii. We have over 500 listed species. And we've already talked about how many of these are incredibly close to extinction, but I want to really focus on how we have very limited capacity. In fact, Matt shared with me that only a third of the enlisted endangered plants we were even able to work on each year due to the hundreds of species that are so critical. And, you know, as David had mentioned, a single lab contains 40 land snail species. And there's been questions about like, how do we get funded compared to the federal government? And a study that was done in 2008 actually reported that on average, mainland species received over 15 times the funding of Hawaiian birds, despite our similar priority ranks. So one of the potential ways that we might soon rectify that is if Congress passes the Recovering America's Wildlife Act, which is currently being heard in the House Committee of Natural Resources. That would actually provide us $60 million to Hawaii and allow for that proportional distribution of endangered species funding. One thing to note is that if we do get that funding, we're going to need to come up with a 25% non-federal match to access that 60 million. So we need to, again, beef up our endangered species funding to be able to magnify the results from that. And wanted to not just end on a doom and gloom note, but remind you folks that we have the tools to recover species, and we need the CIP requests, recurring funding. One of the things that is in the executive budget is a restoration of the 19 positions that were lost in the pandemic for our Division of Forestry and Wildlife. And when you have such small teams, these losses of positions are incredibly damaging. I mean, Dave Sisko, for instance, is the only civil service staff that we have to protect our entire snail fauna, which are hundreds of species and many of them about to go extinct. So just a single loss of the position is huge when you have such a limited capacity already. So we really hope to get help on restoring those positions. And another way that we can do that is just creating these defensible watershed protection areas. I show a picture of Maui here and see how we are basically building a fence around both mountains, kind of circling it like a lei to have a long-term protection of these upland forests from hoofed animals. Another thing that we're doing is planning for recovering populations. So basically, when you have hundreds of endangered species, you need to combine efforts and do things really efficiently. And so we look at individual species and where they exist and where we need to recover them. And then we add and layer on hundreds of those species and find where the top priority areas are. And that's allow us to prioritize sites. So I wanted to thank you folks all, and we'll open it up for, we'll end with Bob Masuda, who can close us out, and then give you folks time to answer questions or ask questions. But I also wanted to call your attention to an interactive map that we have offered that allows you folks to view our CIP requests. And with that, Bob, do you want to say a couple words?
Sure. Yes. First of all, I want to remind everybody on this call from our House Committee that Emma will contact your staff and make available this presentation and all of the other stuff she just mentioned on all the data and research material available to you, so you can have it on your computers. I just want to take a moment we can go back to the main screen. I want to take a moment to you've seen David Smith's David is our administrator and has built an awesome team of a lot of young, brilliant, and inspired young people, a handful of whom you've seen on this presentation. I want to tell you a short story that a few years ago when we had that major hurricane threatening Oahu, I was spending several 24/7 overnights at the Kalanimoku building where we had our Dlnr emergency coordinating center headquarters. So I was taking a short nap about 3 o'clock in the morning in the land division storage room where I had a chair where I could lay out. And I heard these voices and I thought I was hearing the fabled ghosts of Kalanimoku coming around. And I went next door to check. In the middle of this hurricane threat with all the wind and rain were all these young staff, Emma and Cynthia and all of their team, carrying in boxes of snails from the place at Kauai Nui, where it's being reserved and protected, bringing it over to Kalanimoku building to a more hurricane-proof area in the staff coffee room. We had boxes of snails stacked up at 3 o'clock in the morning. These people were carrying them in from Kauai Nui. And that's the kind of inspiration and motivation that these staff you've been hearing, who are brilliant upstairs, but also great in heart and spirit. And I want to share that with you. Thank you. Any questions you have of any of our presenters, we'd be happy to entertain.
Thank you, Dlnr. We'll go ahead into our question and discussion period. Members, if you have questions, please raise your hand digitally. And just as a reminder, our hearing finishes at 2:30. So please keep your questions brief and responses brief as well. Okay. Chair Tarnas, and then followed by Representative Morikawa.
Thank you very much, Vice Chair. I appreciate you taking the lead on this, and thanks to the Dlnr team for your presentation. I wanted to ask about the rapid ohia death. That's such an important, iconic species, keystone species in our forests. Could you talk to us about rapid ohia death control and funding needs for that? That might be a question for David.
Emma? Okay. Rob Hoff is not on this call. He's our point for rapid ohia death, along with several of our staff statewide. But we do not have full funding in our budget right now for rapid ohia death. I will have Rob send you over a summary of where we are, both in terms of matching money and everything else. There is some money in our administration budget for rapid ohia death, and we appreciate the administration's support, but we could use a little bit more to engage and use as match for the private partnerships we have. The effort, Chair Tarnas, is a major, not only public through the state and university and all that, but it's a major effort of private nonprofits and the Invasive Species Committee. So I will have a comprehensive report sent to you, not only on the work, but on the funding.
Please do. I want to know what these additional funding requirements that you have that are not included in the administration's budget.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, that'd be important. Dave, did you have anything to add to that?
Just that I believe our request this year, what we're trying to do is move into recurring funding for forest health. So rapid ohia death is sort of the tip of the iceberg, and it's been a very dramatic and important effort, and it's taught us a lot. A lot of the research and monitoring that we've done has taught us a lot about threats and impacts of forest from hoofed animals and other threats. But with changing climate situation, forests are going to be under stress, and forest health is going to be a continuing issue. I have a feeling that rapid ohia death is just, the tip of the spear. And so we're really looking for, an ongoing forest health program that would include early detection, rapid response, and then biosecurity to start, early detection, rapid response, and then ultimately biocontrol efforts to go after some of these kind of threats that are going to continue to have impacts on our forests. So it's an ongoing
It's a
thing.
major coordinated thing.
Been very has been a wake-up call for us, and it's going to be something that we need to pay attention to going forward.
Yeah, please send the material to me or to Vice Chair, and we'll share it with the committee. Thank you.
Yeah.
Back to
It
you,
is
Vice
a
Chair.
major coordinated thing, Chetan. It's where, fencing for watershed and how we do it also helps protect our ohia lehua and all that. So there's a coordination, and Dave is giving leadership through Rob Hoff and others on we have regular coordination, and probably have 100 people from throughout the mainland, as well as statewide, federal and county and state organizations meeting monthly on updates and how the issues are and all that. So we'll send you that material. Thank you. Thank you, Dave.
Back to you, Vice Chair.
Thank you. Representative Moicall.
Thank you. My question was for exactly what Chair Tarnas was asking. So thank you for that. But I'd just like to thank all of you for this presentation. And, what you guys do today is what the future generations are going to appreciate. So please know that we sincerely appreciate everything you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Kobayashi.
Hi. In the chat room, I text Dlnr good success in keeping some of the seabirds and plants. Whereas I hate to say this, but trying to do the same kind of protection and propagation on Oahu is kind of like a uphill climb. I mean, we just don't have what Kauai has, both the existing species as well as, shall we say, lots of good non-trampled on forest land. I mean, on Oahu, it's just tougher, I think.
One thing to note is that there are a lot of species on Oahu that are still, only found on Oahu. And so that, for instance, our native snails, our Acatenella species, really important. But you're right, in some other places, or some other species, it's not so important. But, Hawaii Island is also critical. It's that's where almost half of our remaining native forest exists on Hawaii Island. So, that's a critical need. Kauai has so much rarity because of it's the old, it's our oldest island. And so everyone really is a special place for endangered species.
Let me ask a question related to prioritization. How do you prioritize who gets money? That is, you have this huge diversity of species, birds, plants, islands, etc. Obviously, we're dealing with limited resources, so we can't fund everything. So how do you pick and choose who gets and who doesn't get?
Let David handle that tough question, but it would make our prioritization a lot easier with a little more color. David?
A lot more color, Bob.
Thank you very much. I'm glad you said it.
Yeah, that is a really tough situation that we're in, you know, lack of capacity and resources. But so we do try to do two things at once. One is to focus on the most critical species that really need a lot of work. And then also looking at large landscape scale approach to managing. So native ecosystems are very robust if undisturbed. And so the one effort is to fence areas and try to remove those disturbances and let those ecosystems thrive on their own. And then there's also these special cases, you know, with things like snails and some of the situations with ground nesting birds, whether they be water birds or you know, some of the forest birds have issues from rats. A lot of the seabirds have issues with ground nesting or introduced mammalian predators. So, you know, we're always looking at, you know, how can we distribute our resources and protect the greatest suites of things. We do have planning efforts underway that'll look at where can we go on the landscape to protect most effectively protect the largest number of species. Like you say, Kauai is incredibly important. It's a very diverse island with lots of native species attributes and lots of issues with endangered species and threatened species. But every island has its own suite of things that are really important. Some islands are more important for, you know, the Big Island is really good on forest birds. Kauai has its forest bird issues, but it's not as high. And so now the mosquitoes are coming in and threatening to wipe out the last of our native forest birds. So, you know, we're just constantly trying to shift around. A lot of times it's sort of like a rear guard action, you know, and we're just, you know, playing defense. What we'd really like to do is have the resources to be able to go on the offense and be able to recover things. So that's the goal, is ultimately is to recover. We just, you know, we have people, like Bob says, you know, we have people with a lot of heart, and everybody is completely committed to this. And so people are constantly analyzing a shifting landscape and trying to figure out where we can most effectively put resources on the ground.
2 points I'd like to add for what David's saying. One, his team is working very closely, and we want to thank you guys for supporting the federal funds that came first, and then we're working on with HTA on getting a portion of the EDA funds, the Economic Development Agency's funding, and that's going to help with our partnership with Kupu. And the Kupu manpower that we're getting are going to, a large number of them are going to be directed through David's team at DOFA into forest restoration work. So we're doing those kinds of things. So the work in cooperating and partnering with all the different agencies that have a common outcome interest, such as HTA, Hawaii Tourism Authority, they want to move towards a more responsible hospitality industry. We want to work with them into showing them how we can better have our visitors join with residents in protecting and caring for our natural and cultural resources. So all of those actions are in play as we speak. So this session coming up in another week or so, when you have hearings, you're going to see and hear the cooperative work that we're doing together. Thanks, Dave. Back to you, Pat.
Members, any further questions?
I have another question, but please go ahead, Vice Chair. You ask your question.
Sure. I wanted to dive in about the KVQ and the Akiki. What are the plans to assist, right? The alala was taken out of the wild and you're trying to reintroduce, but it's not being successful. But what are the current operations to protect those critical species?
The number one thing we're doing in the long game is to try to control mosquitoes. If we don't do that, all of our native birds are going to be in this same boat. There's a couple of birds that are making the adjustment to avian malaria, like the Oahu amakihi and to some extent apapani. But for the most part, our birds are all going to be threatened because the mosquito line is, with global warming, the mosquito line is going up the hill. It's gone. It used to be holding at 4,000. Now we're at 5,000 or more. And that's the problem with, for instance, the Maui parrotbill and the two species, the akikiki and the akike'e on Kauai, that are currently on the brink of extinction. So the long game is control mosquitoes. In the short term, we're just trying to figure out, and there haven't been any decisions being made, but what we're looking at is a couple different options. One is just to continue to manage the birds in the field. The other option is to bring birds into captivity, and there's kind of A and B with that. We're not sure, we don't think we have the capacity locally. And so we're talking to other zoos elsewhere to see, where we could put those birds where we have the highest likelihood of success. One is to bring them in and breed them for eventual re-release. I'm not sure how successful that'll be. The other one is just bring them in until we can get, this mosquito control on the ground, so we can release, birds that are savvy in the field, basically wild caught birds that are brought in for a short period of time and re-released. And then the other option would be to translocate birds. So say take a bird like a koi from Maui, or any of the other species for that matter, and release them, say, on the Big Island, where you still have tall enough mountains to get above the mosquito line. Those are the options that we're looking at. We haven't made any firm decision on any of them. It's one of these rearguard actions. There's not really any good option. We're in a super bad position to begin with, but we're trying to make the best of it and see if we can pull these three species specifically out. But we don't want to be in this position. What we want to do is work on mosquitoes and get ahead of this, so that we don't continue to have a pipeline of critically endangered birds.
And talk about coordination. Our work in eliminating strawberry guava or reducing strawberry guava will help in keeping the mosquitoes lower down. Because as strawberry guava creeps up the mountain, they bring in all the boggy stuff that helps breed mosquitoes. So all of this stuff is interrelated. And Chair Tarnas, I will be sending you, we didn't have time to put it in today, but we have a ports of entry biosecurity team that is running out of a demonstration project funding that was provided through an airport's federal funding kind of thing for the last 4 years to help stop biosecurity threats coming in, rhinoceros beetles and brown tree snakes and all of that. It's running out this coming year. So I've been working with airports deputy and New Harbor's deputy to get access to continuing that project. But I'll send you over, have Dave, if you can have Rob send over the biosecurity stuff to Chair Tarnas. So he and the committee, Pat and Dave, are made aware of that. So, because that's not in our funding budget right now. It was funded through a special pilot project, but it's going to run out. And so we want to bring it to your attention and get your help. But, all of this, ohia, strawberry guava, and all of that are related. How we control that help relate to how we can control mosquitoes. How we control mosquitoes will help in protecting our birds, and our birds can continue pollinating our rare species. Thank you so much, Vice Chair Branco and Chair Tarnas, for bringing together. I see my friend, Representative Kong. You don't have any rare protective birds in your district, but we're protecting your watershed. Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Chair Tarnas, if you would like to ask your question.
Thank you. Yeah, I do look forward to getting information on that biosecurity work you're doing, and also, make sure you can explain to us where you're getting the current funding and where you're requesting, because if it's coming out of DOT, that's appropriate. So if you, I look forward to getting the material and I'll share it with the committee.
Yeah, it'll be coming out of us from now, because it was DOT special funded project only 4 years ago.
Understood. But I
Yeah.
do think that DOT Airports has a responsibility to assist in this too. So, but anyway,
I
won't.
totally
that's not
agree.
for now.
Totally agree.
Not for today, but
Yeah.
I wanted to ask, can you project out your budget? So do you think you'll have sufficient funding to be able to carry out this Wolbachia project? Because, you know, you're focusing on culex, and Department of Health will be focusing on Aedes aegypti. And I don't know whether there's, you know, we'll learn more about it in a separate briefing, but how's your funding look like for that? Because we want to make sure that this succeeds.
Dave.
Yeah, the main effort right now is we're hoping our, leaning on our federal partners to a large extent. I mean, just to kick the thing off in the first year, I think we're looking at a commitment of over $5 million. And so the state's going to need to pony up. We're going to need to come up with some matching funds, but the feds are absolutely committed as well. So we have the National Park Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and USGS and some other partners that are helping us with this. And we also have private partners with the Nature Conservancy. So everybody's chipping in to try to get something on the ground that'll assist, you know, at least at the minimum 2 islands. So we're looking at Kauai and Maui to start. And then we're looking at possibly having a satellite program over on Hawaii Island that might start out at Hakulau. We're not really sure, but the feds are committed, and the state's going to need to step up as well, because it's a fairly significant investment, but it is got real large potential upside for saving a number of species. And
yeah, I just recognize
containing them going forward.
Yeah, I just recognize the urgency of this. I mean, we're facing an existential threat for these forest birds. So it's a priority that we make sure that this is successful. So if you could project out for us, not just this biennium, you know, we're talking about with a supplemental budget, but
in the
looking
future
down the road so that we know what we have to plan for. I mean, that's really important. Vice Chair really is taking the lead on this. So yeah, if you could send it over to us, that'd be great. Back to you, Vice Chair.
Great. Just to jump in for a second, we do have a big interagency meeting on Friday where we're trying to align, you know, our budgets and try to project out. So that work is ongoing, and we will get to you on that.
Yeah,
Great,
Dave,
thank
I
you.
think we should send them all that, even if in draft, just so they can build the perspective. Thank
Yep.
you.
Can
Yeah,
do.
copy me on that.
Yeah.
We're gonna hit time limit. So again, Emma, great job with you and your team. And Representative Kong, Representative Kobayashi, I should have worn my Polaka shirt. David and I, next time we're gonna wear a Polaka shirt. And Vice Chair Branco and Chair Tarnet, thank you so much for giving us this opportunity.
Sure thing, but we're not done yet. Vice Chair, back to
Oh,
you.
okay.
Thank you, Bob.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Just a reminder for the committee, on January 25th, we'll have another informational briefing from 8:30 to 10 a.m. With the Division of Aquatic Resources. But that wraps it up today. Thank you, folks, for being here. And our info briefing is now adjourned. Mahalo.
Thank
Thank you very much. Aloha.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.